Ladies and gentlemen, Cadell Last is magnificent, and I always love speaking with him. And Cadell Last at Philosophy Portal will be teaching on Lacan this fall, which is Écrits, which is an extraordinary text. He's had some wonderful conversations with the integral stage with Layman Pascal. I enjoyed. He was speaking with Parrallax about it, so it's always lovely to have these conversations. And I think Lacan is incredibly important, and that Cadell always elucidates so clearly some of the more difficult thinkers. And so you won't want to miss this class on Lacan that will be starting in the fall on September 3rd that you can sign up today on Philosophy Portal. So today I thought we could talk about some of the seminars in July that Cadell had with Peter Rollins, Isabel Millar, Ruth Boothby, Todd McGowan, which were just really a real blast to be part of, as well as the Philosophy of Lacan series that we did a few years ago that will come back up in light of Lacan, and then in general the class. And to start with a general question, I would like to ask you, Cadell, why Lacan? What do you learn from Lacan, and how has Lacan affected your life in different ways? So Cadell, thank you for being here, sir.
Yeah, great to be here, Daniel, and always a pleasure to talk to you as well, and appreciate all of the work going on with OG Rose and the net. Actually, that was one of the best treats of the summer, to be honest, was having, I think it was a coincidence, but having the seminars for the Écrits and then having the net right after. I felt like that was a nice little synergy there, and opened up some really cool conversations.
Absolutely.
But my history with Lacan goes back to my doctoral days, and it was, I'm still piecing together the story of my doctoral days, and that will I'm sure in the course of my narrative unfold. But I remember arriving in Brussels. I did my doctorate in Brussels, and I was new to the country. I was alone. And I was watching some YouTube videos, and I stumbled across this guy named Zizek. And I was in a mindset. During my doctorate. I had decided when I got on the plane. I decided when I was going. I was like, okay, I've got this opportunity. I've got 4 years, and I've got 4 years to do research that's very open-ended. And I already decided, look, I'm going to be very open to myself, my relationship to knowledge, and what I'm going to expose myself to. For the first year of my doctorate, I exposed myself to many, 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 many different books. I just spent the entire year as when I was in my doctorate, I just went into withdrawal, and I just exposed myself to many, many different books, thinkers, and whatever. But Zizek's work stuck out. It was almost like exposing myself to a multiplicity and then coming to a singularity in that multiplicity. And it wasn't long before all cards on the table, my interpretations of, as I think many contemporary thinkers in our generation, my exposure to thinkers like Lacan and Freud and Marx and Hegel and others comes in some sense as a provocation from the performativity of Zizek and the writing of Zizek, right? So I stumbled upon Zizek's work, and I wanted to find out the thought that was going through my head at the time. I wanted to find out the method by which Zizek was thinking. I realized that there was a way he was thinking which was foreign to me, was novel to me, was other, certainly, to anything else I had experienced or encountered. For me, and this is something that I am still going to be working through for the rest of probably my 30s, to me, Less Than Nothing stuck out as the central book in his works. And if you look at the structure of Less Than Nothing, it says the thing in itself, Hegel, the thing in itself, Lacan. And so and then there's other thinkers adjacent to that. I think Marx, Freud are key thinkers. Plato, Descartes are also key thinkers in that structure. Badiou. But I basically started to work backwards and read the primary source materials of these thinkers. So I remember there was a time of like 6 months, 7 months, where I was doing nothing but read Lacan. was like just doing nothing. I've got this really huge, ridiculous document of like every time Lacan mentioned the word object pitié. I was like, I've got the citation. I was just like, that's the core concept. I'm going to figure out everything I can about this word. And what is going on? What is going on here? Of course, it's the unconscious, but as I just saw today on Twitter, there's a new philosophical text out on the unconscious from a philosophical perspective from 19th century thinkers. Thinkers like Schelling, thinkers like Hegel, thinkers like Goethe, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer. They thought about the unconscious. You read, I was going through Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in great detail. He has some sections in the Spirit chapter where he's talking about the Oedipal complex and unconscious dynamics of the family. So what is it? And even Freud himself would say someone like Nietzsche almost intuits the unconscious, right? And brings it to the philosophical performativity in a way that hadn't been done before. So what's really going on with the Freudian discovery? I think what's going on with the Freudian discovery is a very concentrated, concrete attention to the singularity of everyday speech and the everyday life of the mind. Everyday speech and the everyday life of the mind, and the everyday life of the mind in the Mobius, in what I often say, I don't use the iceberg metaphor for the unconscious, which I think is a misrepresentation of Freud. I use the Mobius loop structure of which is a Lacanian interpretation, but the Mobius, it's like a topographical structure of a weird surface. It's a one twisted into two. And what's going on here with this one twisted into two is the way I think it's just, to me, this is just fun to think about, is to think about I actually brought this up in the first philosophy of Lacan conversation, is to think about Cadell or to think about Daniel in a 24-hour loop. It's like you're on one side of the strip when you're awake and you're on the other side of the strip when you're asleep. And it's like this, and then the total loop is you, but it's almost as if, and Lacan makes this very clear with philosophy, and Freud has a very antagonistic relationship to philosophy as well, which is its own interesting thing. It's almost like philosophy, and as well as science, they're only thinking about one side of the strip. And so when Freud's writing about the interpretation of dreams, that's obviously the first big book, he's bringing the other side of the strip out of just mystical intuitive understanding. And also he's bringing it out of just scientific reductionism. Like, for example, in the interpretation of dreams, Freud's talking about the way in which science sees dreams as useless information, just incoherent, chaotic information. There's nothing to see there, just biological mess there. Whereas mystical, intuitive people, maybe in the spiritual tradition before Freud, would see the dream as like predicting the future or representing the supernatural, right? So you have these two, in some sense now, in light of psychoanalysis, kind of ridiculous opposites. And Freud's basically saying what you find in the dreams is something very simple and profound, which is an unconscious wish, a desire that you see, and Lacan will use this, the mainspring or the wellspring of desire. And consequently, and I think Freud's ideas about dreams are very beautiful, especially in relationship to children and adults, where children's dreams are very simple and direct. Like, if they tell you about the dream, it's usually something like, I wanted an ice cream. There was not a convoluted narrative around the wish. Whereas in adults' dreams, they become very complex and distorted, and this means that, and that means this, and the actual meaning of the dream was some weird symptom in the corner of the dream, but like the dream image was just blocking that or something like that. It becomes basically through various mechanisms we know now, like repression, foreclosure, disavowal. These are symbolic mechanisms that are operating in adults basically to function as adults, to assume a symbolic function as a Cadell or Daniel, as adults in the world who have enormous responsibility, all these things. That basically what happens is that we have to make compromises with our desire. We have to make compromises with the wellspring of the primary process of our mind. And of course, Lacan will then develop the axiom of do not compromise on your desire. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't just mean you directly just go for immediate gratification, but it does mean that you, as it were, in the language of someone like a Daniel Garner might say, you negate sublate, and you try to remain faithful to the truth of your desire. That does not mean immediate gratification and stuff like that. It just means that you're willing to go through the arduous struggles and labors involved in actualizing your desire, as opposed to it just being a fantasy in a naive way. So I know that's a long answer, but basically, if I was to just bring it all home in terms of what I'm trying to say here, is that psychoanalysis made me aware that it was possible to scientifically or intellectually take an interest in the everyday life of the mind and the dream mind in a way that I was not getting objectively in my doctoral studies in cognitive science, as I was taking cognitive science and neuroscience courses in my doctorate, but they were just so dry. And then when I was reading Freud on the interpretation of dreams, when I was reading Freud on jokes and their relationship to the unconscious, and when I was reading Freud on the psychopathologies of everyday life, this is a triad of books that Freud wrote at the beginning of his career, which are showing you the genius, the wit of the joke, which are showing you the ways in which the weird slips and bungled actions of everyday life have enormous meaning and value, and sometimes quite disturbing. And that dreams are a source of a deep intelligence, not an intelligence, again, of a supernatural or not anything like that. It's more an intelligence of the subject's history and the desire of the subject's history. So I'll stop there.
Well, that was outstanding. So a few things come to mind. First, on the performative of Zizek, I think there's a book by a man named Turner on imagining. He says, and Layman actually mentioned this, if you go back and look at a lot of the prophets, say in the Torah, they're doing pretty crazy things, like wearing the same underwear for an extended period of time, causing sort of fire, because basically when someone has something important to say, one of the reasons it's probably important to say is because the society won't allow it to be said. And so how do you get people to listen? You have to be performative. You have to bring a certain sort of air. And I think actually Zizek can teach a lesson to a lot of intellectuals and a lot of academics who may have a lot of value to add, but may not have developed the ways of, say, being performative, not in a fake way, but in a manner to draw people in. And you see that, Layman was talking about the shaman doing that. And I think you see that in some of the prophets. I always like that section in Turner's book where he talks about the performative artists in religious tradition, and the prophet is quite good. I think also it is very interesting to think of Zizek's method, because a part of his method seems to be whatever you think is other is part of. So when you start talking about love and you say love is the opposite of hate, no, somehow hate is in love. So you have to talk about hate. And he's always kind of bringing in what seems to be an opposite into the concept that you are discussing, which destabilizes it and then opens up entirely new thoughts. And Zizek, it would be quite interesting if someone were to write, I know Peter Rollins has mentioned some of like Zizek's method, but like the method that he's bringing forth, which of course is a method that comes from psychoanalysis, Hegel, being for self. Actually, there's otherness that is part of that alien, enter the alien of the first anthology from Philosophy Portal, and how whatever we disavow is probably something we disavow because it says something about us we don't want to be too explicit. So we're always pushing away. So one, the very bringing of that method and making and doing it so well in a performative manner makes Zizek, in my opinion, just utterly invaluable. A few more things come to mind. One of the reasons Lacan and psychoanalysis for me has become so important is because in a way, psychoanalysis is making explicit the logic of literature that is implicit, that has to be brought out. I believe Lacan, correct me if I'm incorrect about this, I thought in his biography when I was reading up on Lacan, he considered English teacher, doing literature, different things like that. I think that says a lot, because when you look at the great works of literature, you see psychoanalysis all over it. Because the great writers are, Flannery O'Connor had this lovely line where he said the writer must not be afraid to stare, or he used the different words like gape or whatever. And you see a great writer is paying very close attention to how the world works. And if they actually and accurately describe how the world works, well, you're going to show a map of psychoanalysis, if indeed psychoanalysis is true, right? And the very fact that, say, in great literature, you actually see many principles that come up in Freud, that come up in Lacan, functions as a kind of proof that psychoanalysis is actually getting at something real. Because if literature works, that showing self-deception, for example, if you see in so many characters self-deception, or ways that Miss May in Greenleaf is self-enclosing herself, or Harold Bloom once said, one of my favorite ideas, he says in Chekhov's plays, you have to understand that people who love one another never understand one another. Like, they are always misunderstanding, and how words are primarily red herrings, right? These are all the things of great literature. And what Lacan is often doing is basically making explicit principles of great literature. And it turns out that great literature is great literature because it tends to describe something that's actual, that's actually concrete and human, and just doing it in a very focused and concentrated manner. But if it's more distilled in the everyday life that people are living, not all of us are Othello or Hamlet or whatever, then how do we follow it? Well, with something like psychoanalysis, we can see it. And if we want to take another step and go with my claim that fiction is the mathematics of the humanities, it's a kind of proof of A-B onto epistemology, then the very fact of making that explicit, through making literature's principles explicit, it is actually going to be saying utterly invaluable truths about, well, the world, an A-B world, and all of that then kind of trickles down to say that AA is problematic. And so for me, I always like this idea of Othello that I think kind of captures a lot of what psychoanalysis wants to explore. And I'll say my own interest. Othello at one point, Iago says, I am not what I am, right? I am not what I am, that I am able to do things that don't identify me. And for me, coming from a literature background, irony is fascinating. Self-deception is fascinating, because if you think about it, how is self-deception possible? How is it possible for a human being to deceive themselves? That shouldn't be possible, right? Like, you know what you're doing, unless thought doesn't work like we think it works, right? Likewise, how is irony possible? Irony being you do X to get Y, and X isn't Y, you get Y. How is that possible? Because you would only do X if you genuinely believed X would get you Y. Well, it must be because the mind doesn't work the way that we think it works, right? Thinking, which seems to make everything very straightforward and self-evident, must not actually be doing that. It must be in some kind of other business. Well, what is that other business? You have to get into psychoanalysis. You have to get into the ways that the brain is in the business of convincing itself it's found the truth, all while it avoids the truth. And it's a much more. And then, of course, that tendency trickles throughout all actions of thought. And I think that speaks also to some of the problem with the iceberg metaphor, because I agree, the iceberg metaphor too much suggests kind of a separation between conscious and subconscious, right? Like the subconscious is down here and the conscious is up here, when really they're always kind of intertwined. Like, there are different emphases, different times of day, but they're always kind of looping into one another, right? And I like a loop image because it suggests that they're on the same gradient, right? They're all going together. And someone may say, well, an iceberg's like that too. Yeah, but the iceberg, you're never going below the surface of the iceberg, right? It doesn't really show this kind of permanence. So I think the metaphor can be problematic. And indeed, I think also when I hear Lacan talking about, don't forsake desire, basically you can't escape desire. And in Nietzsche, you can make a distinction between will and want, right? Like, want is kind of the instantaneous gratification, where will is this negation, sublation, where you're not saying wants are bad, but you are saying wants are bad if you're escaping yourself in the wants. Like the difference between want as escapism and will as a kind of overcoming, right? Well, likewise, what Lacan wants to suggest basically is that if you don't deal with desire is still going to show up. Like, the option of getting rid of desire entirely is not on the table. And if you think you've done it, that's precisely when you're most in danger. And so, but you see, of course, one of the great problems with a thinker like Lacan is all of their terms are backed by an entire lifetime of text and thinking that to understand what they mean by desire, you need to do the whole thing. Same happens with Hegel, right? And so one of the reasons why teaching thinkers like Lacan and Hegel is so important is precisely because all of their terms are so situated within an entire body of work that has to be understood to know what they mean. So when Lacan talks about desire, he's not meaning it such as you hear desire in everyday speech, although it has something to do with it. You have to understand that desire is precisely the mechanism of motivation. Desire is what makes human beings go through. And a final point, and then I'll give it back to you, is it makes me think also, Augustine basically has this idea that there's no such thing as an evil motivation. Like if you do it, you think it's good to do. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it, right? Well, that means that in all action, there's some trace of a desire. Maybe it's very automatic. Maybe it's just subconscious. Maybe you don't even know it's there, but there's some sort of desire to do X if you do X because you believe it's good to do X, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. Well, another reason why psychoanalysis became so interesting to me is because if there's no such thing as an evil motivation, basically, everyone does what they do because they think it's good, and yet people all the time end up in bad situations, well, then thinking can't be trusted without great examination. Thinking cannot be trusted without great negation sublation. Frankly, one of the most kind of life-changing ideas I heard, it's that my grandmother once said on the porch, is she said, and my dad said it as well at a different time, she was like, nobody gets married planning to get a divorce. And to me, that was staggering because when people get married, they're like literally willing to give their life up for the other person, right? Like everything. And yet gradually through time, people often, like divorce is nasty often. Like it becomes a lot of hatred, a lot of disdain. How is this possible? How is it possible then that occurs? Well, it must be because the brain doesn't think what you think it does. So you have to explore these things. And I think if you don't talk about the psychoanalytical in Lacan, you're completely vulnerable to all of these different topics. And I'll give it back to you. And as a quick note, there might be a massive storm coming for all of our viewers. So if some reason all of this cuts out, I think we have time. That's why. So just as a warning. But no, literature, Lacan, all of those things to me just go together in such critical ways.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the things you're saying there, to me, it sounds like, Lacan is such a topographical thinker, and bringing in the ideas of topology. It's like models of human beings, which I think we can trace back to Plato and Aristotle, of basically models of self-consciousness and models of the human is the rational animal. It's almost like thinking in terms of Euclidean geometry. Like you're just thinking in terms of a flat or a simple surface. And so if you're not thinking about the way in which that flat or simple surface objectively twists and bends over to another side that you're not thinking about, and actually that other side that twists and bends to the other side that you're not thinking about is neither dumb animal instincts nor supernatural, ineffable, mystical phenomena, but thinking, but thought. Like the other side is thought, intelligent thought. The unconscious is intelligent. The unconscious has its own, has its own, is itself. This is where Freud talks about jokes and slips of the tongue as intelligent. Manifestation, dreams as a certain intelligence of the subject's history. If you're not thinking about yourself as this twisted loop, well, then you're not going to be able to understand some of these paradoxes that you were describing, like nobody goes into marriage wanting to get divorced, and yet the divorce rate's at 50%. There must be an other side. There must be an other of self-consciousness, which is your own most intimacy or extimacy, and not taking that into consideration, not seeing that as the truth of yourself on which you're in some sense decentered from. You're gonna have a bad time, and you're gonna have a bad time in a very specific, in a very intimate way. You're gonna have a bad time with the other. Right. You're gonna, and of course I would start with, you're gonna have a bad time with the intimate other. So Freud would of course start with the father, the mother, the child. right? Now in a pre-child state, you're going to have a bad time with the intimate partner. You're going to be unable to both get a distance from the family in which you grew up, and consequently you're going to have trouble establishing a new life. You're going to have trouble, and this dynamic of, we need families, we also need to distance ourselves from families, and we need to distance ourselves from families so we can establish a new family. And how to go about that is basically the problem of the generational link. It's the problem of the fact that humans reproduce themselves, and we are generational species, we're developmental species. And so it seems to me like psychoanalysis here, if we read it properly, can be quite a revolutionary tool, because it's a tool that can help us think again how to reestablish generations. It's a tool that can help us think about the fact that liberalist individualism was always a fantasy, and a fantasy of a kind which radically disconnects us from the real of the other. And what would it mean to once again reestablish fictions which had a real to them, and were derived from the real of our generational links and bonds with each other. And that brings us to the intersubjectivity of truth. And it very might well be that in the same way that I think that you in your genius stumbled upon the logic of A, B, in some sense, independently, or seemingly independently. You'd have to tell the story about it one time, but in a quite similar way, in a quite shocking way, like, I'm going to try and bring this out in the course, I would make the argument that Lacan agrees, and also makes a similar argument that fiction is the mathematics of the humanities. And the way in which Lacan approaches fiction is quite interesting from the beginning, because for Lacan, fiction is not just imaginary, it's the imaginary grounded in a symbolic real. Because it in some sense, and this is also connected, I think, to Plato's cave walls and the becoming of spiritual children and stuff like that as well, because the cave walls are just specular images. But to actually write a true fiction requires the imaginary and the symbolic, and requires the mediation of a real story. And in some sense, I think that's where the axiom of the beyond the fiction of reality, there's the reality of fiction. I really like that slogan. But yeah, I mean, just as a final point before passing it back to you, I think that what I see the potential of this course is to bring out in Lacan the way, it's almost like in the same way that Lacan was doing a return to Freud. Because why was he doing a return to Freud? He was doing a return to Freud because he thought the institutions had watered down the original method that Freud had developed, and specifically in regards to the criticality of the symbolic in analytic training. In the same way, maybe a return to Lacan is necessary, because what seems to be so clear in Lacan is that he is bringing out the socio-historical implications of psychoanalysis for society. Like he's from the very beginning of the Écrits, he's making it clear. Psychoanalytic knowledge has implications for intersubjectivity, politics, thinking royalty, thinking power, thinking all these things, politics, thinking law, thinking ethics, thinking criminals, thinking all of these social dimensions of life, which and also thinking patriarchy, thinking on all of these dimensions. And so this would be my final thing to say before passing it back to you, that my hypothesis would be that maybe the return to Lacan is necessary because the genuine innovation in psychoanalysis that has come after Lacan, to my mind, has actually come from philosophy, not psychoanalysis. You know, the Zizekian tradition and many others, Badiou as well, and many others. But it seems like the genuine innovations are coming from philosophy, which seems to me to mean that in order for psychoanalysis to revive itself, it needs to make it clearer the way in which it's connected irreducibly to phenomenon like politics, education, family, religion, and so forth. And that's a big work to be done. And I see, in some sense, the class as participating in that work, because not only myself but the guest lecturers are spontaneously pointing in that direction. Isabel Millar's talking about patty politics. Richard Boothby's talking about Das Ding and religion. You know, Peter Rollins is talking about the Church of the Contradiction. Todd McGowan's going to talk about capitalism and value. So this is all work to be done.
You said so many fantastic things. First, basically, we have not fought first world societies because you require Lacan. First world societies is usually used as an insult. Oh, that's so first world, First Nation problems. What would you if you lived in a poor society? It's all trade-offs, because first world societies are more psychological and they're more subject-based. And also it changes the character of everything. The nature of law in a first world nation's politics, family, work, everything changes when you're dealing with first world. And you see, basically, we haven't thought it. I think it's extremely evidenced by the economy is going into like business cycles, booms and busts, constant political conflict, fascism. Like if you look at the first world nations, they have not thought themselves because they have not thought psychoanalysis. And I think the point you just made at the end about connecting Lacan to all of these issues, which all of the seminars in July were about in different areas, it's basically like psychoanalysis presents an entirely new horizon of practice. There's a way in which psychoanalysis is not practical because it is the horizon of practice. It changes everything. It changes how you practice, which makes it like it's extremely practical in another sense. But we don't think of psychoanalysis as practical. But if you take seriously that thought structures itself towards you in a manner that makes you prone to self-deception, then how you practice and carry yourself in the world changes. If you take seriously that speech is primarily in the business of hiding, or as opposed to unveiling, well, then the way you think about democracy changes. Everything changes. The kind of art you do, everything shifts. And so we have not thought of Lacan as the horizon of which needs to be owned to organize well practices in first world societies, or you could say more white collar societies, really, or technologically heavy societies. Like you mentioned the family. So you had that wonderful talk with Daniel Tutt that I appreciated very much. For most of human civilization, the family was less, if you will, psychological, because it was a unit to address the logistical challenges of life. Like before technology, it was a whole lot of work to run a home, a whole lot of work to go out and make money, a whole lot of work to eat. And so even if the husband and wife and the family didn't really get along or didn't know each other, they actually could get along simply by having an external task, right? Almost like an external enemy in a Smithian sense, right? Like nations are bound by a common enemy, blah, blah, blah. Well, I can tell you, like working blue collar jobs, you can have people that are radically different from you, and yet you have an incredibly close bond because you unload the truck together, because you drive the truck. Like work, blue collar labor tends to like bring people together, even if you don't have a common bond or you don't understand one another, because the external task of loading the truck is a kind of common language that brings you together. Well, the same used to happen in the household. The same happened with families. Like basically the husband and wife were raising the children. Well, now you can choose not to have children. So everything, as you move into the future, what you're seeing is a world that's becoming more psychological, basically, to use that term. Well, that means the ways of avoiding the psychological tricks of the subject or the way that the brain works are no longer avoidable. And we don't understand them, because to understand them, you'd have to go into Freud and Lacan and literature and psychoanalysis. So what ends up happening instead is people are looking for ways, like you mentioned with Mr. Tutt, of avoiding intimate partnership, avoiding marriage and family, and certainly having children, because children brings out everything. And so if you don't have like an external work to turn to, then you have to deal with the person and the subject and the psychological, and you don't have the tools to do it. And then you see the other things, people say, well, wait a minute, don't people still have jobs? Don't they still have careers? A lot of those careers are themselves more psychological. They themselves are not filling a cooler. It's answering emails and involving the person. And likewise, people are using careers to avoid intimate partnerships, right? So these things are all blurring in very problematic ways. You basically, as history develops, we tended to think we were going to be able to remove the subject through the scientific method and get it out. But actually what's happened is kind of like you talk about the revenge of philosophy. It's the revenge of the subject. The subject is coming back as more unavoidable than ever before. And so we have to think it, and we haven't thought it, so we don't have the horizon to engage in the proper practices to deal with politics in first world nations, to deal with technology in first world nations. We don't know how to go about it. So Lacan, to me, is absolutely necessary. And I think the other thing too is, like you mentioned, Aristotle and the rational animal. Well, the funny thing is, the problem is that the human is the rational animal. That's not why we're special and like gods or whatever. The problem is that we're rational animals, and rationality, it turns out, is more in the business of coherence than it is correspondence. It is precisely rationality that leads one into ideological enclosures, that leads one into self-deception, because rationality can be separated from correspondence. And to me, like, a way I think about it is I actually think basically thinking and dreaming are the same act. Like thinking and dreaming, like thinking like the other dreaming is fantasy and what you do while you're asleep. But the mental act actually seems very similar. The only difference is that when you think, it's about determinations and reality. When you dream, basically dreaming unveils what thought actually is, which is unbound coherence. It can always create a world. It can always cohere with one another. I was talking with Matthew Stanley about this. It can always create a logic. And the thing about a dream, you just go with it. You don't even think about it. You're just, oh yeah, I can fly. Unless it's a lucid dream, you just go with it, right? That's actually what we do in the real world all the time. We just go, oh yeah, capitalism's best. We don't even think, we just go with it. Oh, communism works. We just go with it, right? So the zeitgeist is the dream, the real dream that you're always just going with. And rationality is precisely just simply the brain seeking coherence to keep out the real, to keep out the realization that we are not what we are, to reference Iago. And so what we see in Freud and Psych, basically they're all pointing that dreaming and thinking are two sides of the same coin, basically. I'm not saying that thinking is just dreaming, but most thinking is like daydreaming. You don't, like when you're about to speak, do you always think about like intentionally what you're going to say next? Often you just find yourself speaking. You find yourself, ideas pop into your head, right? There is such thing as intentional thought, in the same way that there's lucid dreaming, intentional dreaming, if you will. But those, I would argue, are more exception than the rules. The majority of thinking is much more emergent and mysterious and kind of pointing out, as opposed to intentional thinking, in the same way that lucid dreaming is more an exception than it is the norm. And so thinking and dreaming are two really, really similar. And that would mean you need psychoanalysis to understand thinking, which you need to understand psychology and the person and the subject, which in a first world nation is necessary in order to survive. And that makes me think then of, and then I'll give it to you, of like Peter Rollins and the Church of the Contradiction, and the need to actually have a church that is teaching lack, that is teaching contradiction. Because once you get that the human is a rational animal, and that's the problem, because rationality is more like dreaming, it's more like this Mobius strip, well, then you need a church that is going to be thinking the contradiction and living the contradiction. And funny enough, whereas we've associated the first world society with escaping contradiction, with escaping irrationality, actually, it turns out that the first world nation is where the inevitability of the contradiction becomes unavoidable, because you can't avoid it with needing to load a truck or daily tasks so much. It's there. And if we don't have a church for it, which then gets into Peter Rollins' wonderful work, and I know he also had that great presentation on grace and alienation the other day and talked about they live. That was also quite good. I really enjoyed that. And like the Church of Contradiction becomes very, very relevant for a religion, and religion is always tied with social capital, to think the contradiction, which seems to be the necessary horizon to be practical in first world societies.
Yeah, lots of important thoughts there. You know, what's coming to my mind is I watched a really fantastic movie this week. It was called The Witch. It's have you seen that?
I
The
have seen
Witch?
that. I like that
It's
director. Yeah.
yeah, Eggers. I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Robert
Jeffrey
Eggers is his
Eggers or
name.
something like that. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah. Anyway, it's I think it's a fantastic movie. There's a lot to dive in there, and specifically this relationship between, let's say, the rationality of Christianity, the internal coherence of Christianity. I'm referencing the movie here.
Yeah.
The rational internal coherence of Christianity as it functions for the father, in the movie, who's by all accounts extremely devout, and as actually he's ostracized from his town, actually on the basis of accusations of being prideful. And he takes his family out into the wilderness to live near a forest and live a sustainable life outside of the village. And all of these weird things outside of his rational explanations start happening. What's interesting and basically witchy things start happening. Well, what are these witchy things? These witchy things suspend the normal rules of causality. There's a peekaboo game, the baby just disappears. You don't see the link of how the baby disappeared. And what's interesting at the end of the movie, not giving away anything, just recommending it, is the main character basically becomes a witch and starts flying. You're not left with any rationale for this. It's like, oh yeah, I can fly. But what you're seeing here is kind of the two sides of the Mobius strip at once. And actually, you're seeing it perhaps also dramatized in regards to sexual difference between the patriarch, who is trying to establish some coherence, who is trying to establish some sort of bounded rationality, which can keep out the real. And you're constantly seeing the real invade in such a way as that it disturbs his rationality, to the point where at the end of the movie, he gets down on his knees, putting dirt in his mouth, screaming to God, saying, I am prideful. Just let me keep my children. And then he gets killed by a goat. So just wanted to make this relationship between, on the one hand, the rational self-consciousness trying to create a bounded coherence, trying to create a bounded coherent world, and the unconscious, or the other side, which, let's remember, I think this is absolutely crucial. Psychoanalysis starts with paying attention to women's negative emotions. That should not be understated. The limit, and Freud discovered, who was a neurologist, Freud discovered internal to his neurology practice and scientific work, the limit of science is very clear: women's negative emotions. Like, that is profound. So, and again, this movie demonstrates this quite well, because the figure of the witch and feminine jouissance, feminine enjoyment, and all throughout the movie, the feminine character, the main character, is constantly the object of scapegoating, right? And the witch is always the object of scapegoating. And so this feminine, this other side, this mysterious other side, is, I think, linked to the unconscious. And if we can bring ourselves to this other side, I think what's at stake is we move away from a very simplistic idea of intentional thinking, like you were saying, where, again, if I use the character of the witch, the main character of the witch, the father, he was a man of intentional thinking. I'm gonna go out and get the horse, and I'm gonna go kill the wild animals, and we're gonna plant some seeds, and we're gonna have a harvest, and all of his intentions get thwarted. All of his intentions get internally disturbed by the other side, the witch. And it's always emergent, it's always mysterious, it's always breaking our normal understandings of causality. In some sense, the whole movie is these slips where intentionality doesn't quite work. So the main message here is that I think when we start thinking with the unconscious, we start paying attention to the way in which I intended X, but Y happened. I don't know why Y happened. My intent was X. Now, it's not that I'm bad, it's not that I'm evil, it's not that Y is bad or evil, but it must mean that there is an irreducible other internal to my thought, which I better take account of and work with as the truth, or else I'm going to get trapped in my own intentional circle. And the real is not going to go away. The real potentially might get more disturbing.
That's excellent, and that movie is wonderful. And I think his the movie he did after that, I believe, is the Northman. The Northman. That's an excellent.
I'm tempted to check this out.
It's excellent. And I won't spoil it, but there's a similar operation of a logic that is coherent that then it turns out perhaps not to be what they thought it was. And the character has a choice, either buckle down and follow the logic, which, you know, where it goes may not be good or it might be good, but it's a similar sort of problem. What do you do when the slip appears? How do you respond when the slippage occurs? And I can't help but think, like, going through some of, like, on the idea of patty politics or Lacan or the church, like, very often politics today, if a witch shows up, the political order collapses. Like, we can't handle the witch. What would it mean to have a political order if a witch showed up? You say, well, of course, yeah, come here, sit over here. Like, it didn't actually shatter when the witch showed up. That would be almost what you have to start thinking, to think about Lacanian politics or Lacanian family or Lacanian basically everything. It's the ability to respond to the slip in a manner that doesn't destroy. Of course, it's going to be hard. Of course, there's going to be a lot of negativity. You could even say, I guess, the difference between fragile and anti-fragile with Nassim Taleb, right? Like, what would it mean to have an anti-fragile politics where when the other is introduced to the Republican Party doesn't freak out and turn to fascism. They actually get stronger and better for it, right? Likewise, when you introduce the other, or the conservative who doesn't believe in various, say, critical race theories. How does critical race theory get stronger encountering the person that disbelieves it, as opposed to trying to other that slip and get rid of it? That, to me, is a lot of the difference here. And we haven't really thought that, because we basically erected all of the systems on stopping slips, on stopping things from breaking through, as opposed to being ready for things breaking through. And you know, it's also too interesting with the goat. You know, when we think, you know, the goat is often associated with the devil. And so when we think scapegoat, it's like a scape devil. Who do we turn into the devil to get rid of, who's not actually a devil? And basically all of politics now is making someone the devil, the scapegoat. And I think sometimes by calling it scapegoat, you actually lose sight of what's going on there. When you say scape devil, because the goat is a symbol for the devil, you actually start seeing how a moral logic appears. Of course you should scape the devil. Of course you should get the devil. Well, the problem is the devil just always happens to be the devil you need for your ideology to survive.
Correct me if I'm wrong as well, but the devil is also God, right?
The devil, there are some traditions in Christianity. No, the devil would not be God. Now I will say this: Paul definitely talks about the devil as the God of this age. So he's like a lowercase g God. That's absolutely true. And he's actually kind of sovereign and very powerful. Now, this gets us into all the problem of evil.
He's a fallen God.
He's a fallen angel in Christianity.
He's a fallen angel. Okay.
Yes,
okay,
he's the highest angel. Lucifer becomes Satan.
He's the highest angel.
Now, I definitely think, I think it's not false to say the devil is a god, because that's how Paul talks about him. He's like the Lord of the age, the God of this age. So it's actually, I actually think it would be a conversation on Christian theology. I actually think Christian theology has greatly suffered from not really taking seriously that the devil has a kind of sovereignty. Now, you could say it's within God's ultimate sovereignty within the mythology, but there's a lot there that has been missed. But definitely the devil is a Lord of the age. He is definitely a fallen angel. But you see, that also, that speaks to Lacan, because you plan to get married to be happy, and it turns out to be hell for people, right? Like, people's desire, when they don't negate, sublate them, turns out to be a source of destruction. Ivan Illich has this wonderful line where he says, the best of things, when corrupted, is the worst of things. Like, you know, in Dante, basically only saints can be Hitler, because only saints have the capacity for goodness that, if not filled, becomes ultimate evil, because evil is a privation. So one of the reasons why Lacan, for me, is so important is because Lacan shows you how the very capacities of the human being for good, for greatness, when you don't realize the mechanisms of self-deception or self-enclosure, turn into precisely the sources of great destruction. Like, we too much separate the potential good of the human from being the same potential of the bad, if it is misordered, if it is misunderstood. So if you don't take seriously this stuff on irony, self-deception, et cetera, so forth, that the psychoanalytical thinkers are going for, if you don't attend a church of contradiction per se, you are in trouble. Like, Peter Rollins was saying that, in Lacan, basically, loss becomes lack, right? Like, loss, you can never fulfill it. Lack becomes ontological, right? Like, if you don't know that, you might spend your entire life trying to fill the loss, the missing out on the thing you always wanted. And then you're going to start blaming people if you don't get it. You're going to destroy all your relationships. Maybe you'll go into jobs you hate thinking you're going to find somewhere to deal with that loss. And your life may suck, basically. And actually, the greater potential you had, the more the negative consequences can be if you seek to fill a loss as opposed to integrate with a lack. That would be like the Christian message, is like, greatness is a risk. Like, if you're capable of great things, then you should have great fear and trembling, because greatness correlates with, greatness doesn't have to be good. It can be evil. And this actually, frankly, to me, this is why it's so dire, because first world nations, because again, like Freud said, psychoanalytic, it tends to be first world nations that have suicide rates. And we're not saying everyone in America is rich, but we're saying the society tends to move in a white collar direction, technological, so on and so on and so on. But you see, if first world nations generally have more power or potential technologically, economically, and so on and so forth, that precisely from a Christian standpoint would be why they're capable of such destruction and such evil and horror, if they don't understand their own nature, their own mechanisms of understanding. Therefore, not only do you need psychoanalysis to survive or to make a first world nation thrive, and then I'll give it to you, without it, a first world nation will probably become a source of terror. It will probably become a destructive force on the global stage, maybe to its own populace. Like, that would, precisely being the first world nation is why, if you're corrupted, you become the worst of things. And then psychoanalysis would be following the mechanisms by which humans in their greatness become terrors, in which Lucifer becomes Satan. So I think the stakes of first world nations engaging in psychoanalysis are great, because again, like, so many people talk about the meaning crisis, the mental health crisis. I know there's 10,000 phrases, 10,000 different crises, but the meta crisis, the poly crisis,
crises of crises, everything is a crisis.
Pick your own adventure crisis, crisis. But anyway, a lot of people are focusing on the mental health, saying, oh my gosh, we need to understand the subject. And I think there's validity to that. But there's also another side where actually this failure to integrate psychoanalysis, and I think psychoanalysis is the depth you have to go to, because it's really dealing with the dark renaissance, the real. That is what can explode out in a first world nation, and you start to get the Satan from precisely the Lucifer, right? All first world nations, in a sense, are a kind of Lucifer that are yet to fall, and without psychoanalysis, they will fall. It's only a matter of time. It's not merely going to be boredom, but it's going to manifest in violence and who knows what else, misery in general.
Yeah, there's no question about that, and this is a lesson that I feel like it's deeply interwoven with the history of psychoanalysis. Here, referencing the paper that Freud wrote on the First World War, which I know Michelle and Dimitri also had a conversation about, which was great. There's something very special about that, because in the early 20th century, there were a lot of fantasies about Enlightenment progress. And funny enough, I mean, there are still fantasies about Enlightenment progress, like when you have books like Steven Pinker's that just came out, basically arguing similar things that would have been found in the common narrative of the early 20th century. But then you have something like the First World War. And the First World War is one of those interesting things where you can't have a First World War among third world countries. In order to have a First World War, you need to be a first world country.
Yes.
In other words, there's a certain level of technological development which opens up all new evils which were not possible before, all new horrors which were not possible before. And so it massively complicates the narrative of progress. And that's something that also needs to be thought in regards to the new technological developments that are happening in the 21st century, when, you know, someone like Ray Kurzweil talks about the revolutions of genetic engineering, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and robotics. He calls it the GNR revolutions. You know, these GNR revolutions open up fantastical possibilities. They also open up an entire Pandora's box of potential evil of who knows what scale. Probably an unimaginable scale of potential nightmares could emerge there. And then in terms of the question of integrating psychoanalysis, so to speak, into our society as an important task, it's really, really confusing how to think this. And it reminds me of when you're talking about, for example, about communities of absolute knowing, is basically, it basically reminds me of a scaling problem.
Yes.
And the profound difficulty of scaling problems. You know, in some sense, Lacan is a symptom of the difficulties of scaling.
Yes.
You know, like Lacan was necessary after Freud because of the difficulties of scaling an institution about psychoanalysis, for example. You know, someone like Zizek will often say what we need, or what we're dealing with in terms of the intellectual motion that we're variously a part of, is something like an organized crowd as opposed to an institution.
Yeah.
You know, like that what's going on is kind of, it's not something that can consolidate itself in an institution. It's not something that can even be represented as in an institution. Like, for example, he literally said to me, don't use me as a reference on your CV if you're applying for professor jobs, because it will hurt your chances. So, you know, again, so what we're dealing with here is not necessarily something that institutions can take up into themselves. I think it's much more that what we're looking for is a qualitatively, and I use this word, I never know what the best word is, but because what I'm encountering inside myself is, when I was in my doctorate, I went through a semi-ideological dogmatic phase of communism. The motion here is a qualitatively different style of whatever you want to say, community, social organization, network. There's many words we could use, different groups, even in Deleuzian language, assemblages. But what we're looking for here is a qualitatively different style of organization, network, community, where it's not, I think what's crucial is it cannot be under the banner of a one. Meaning it can't just be integrated into one without excess. That whenever there's a one, and this is to me and this is something that I've got to always make more self-reflexive. Whenever you establish a one on the level of language, on the level of a signifier, if you're paying attention objectively, what should be very obvious are the symptoms of that one.
Mm.
Meaning the one never closes completely and everyone is happy in the one. What happens is that there are people happy with the one. There is a way in which the one works. There are also imminent symptoms of the one. There seems to be an imminent problem. It seems to be an imminent containment problem. That there is no one. There is no boundary that can contain everyone.
Right.
And it's this very real. It's this very real, which produces new ones. And so this is a very strange reality that we need to think. And I think that is also a problem which psychoanalysis speaks to, because Alenka Zupancic will end her book on What is Sex, which to me is a radical political book, first and foremost, where she says the reactivation of a gap in relationship to the one is the location of both the unconscious and politics. The reactivation of a gap internal to a one. The crucial thing is that the gap has a form which could not have existed without the one that established itself. It has the shape, the gap has the shape or the form it does because of the introduction of the one. And then from that gap or form, which is producing a symptom, it's basically like a genetic, it's almost like a genetic reproduction process where a new symbolic one will emerge from that. And that somehow is what we need to think with politics, not on the level of biology, genetic lineages, but now bringing this full circle to what you were pointing at is Lacanian politics, the Lacanian family, right? Where we have to think the unconscious. And this problem of, in the modern world, the increased psychologization, the increased, I was talking to Owen about this, and this is actually a cause for some people to withdraw, is being overwhelmed by the excess of subjectivity. Basically, there's too much subjectivity.
Right.
There's so much subjectivity. And this is, to me, it requires titanic levels of negation sublation, right? Which, of course, everyone will have their limit with this, because not everyone, again, there can't be a, but what seems to be imminent is the excess of subjectivity. I'll leave there.
Magnificent. So you brought up the problem of scale. The magnitude of that problem cannot be overstated. It might be the problem, frankly, the problem of scale, the problem of spread, et cetera, so forth. So a few things. First, one of the reasons why I think a lot of religions had myth narrative literature is because it's one thing for me to say, don't be self-deceived. It's an entirely another thing to see a story by which self-deception works when the characters don't know it's an operation. Like, you need story to function as a kind of phenomenological example of the ways that we use speech to avoid desire or the other, or to keep others away. And one of the problems that has happened is by getting rid of the humanities or getting rid of the arts, or frankly, the style of Lacan is important because the style requires a wrestling with what he is saying so that you internalize what he's saying, as opposed to just making it a fact where you go, okay, humans are prone to self-deception. And you say, check. No, you don't understand the mechanisms of the self-deception unless you wrestle with the material, unless you read a story that shows it. And frankly, here's the problem. You knowing that humans are prone to self-deception as a fact may actually make you more prone to self-deception because you become overconfident. So I think the first thing is we see here one of the reasons why story, myth, narrative, Lacanian styles, performative styles, all of these different things actually are quite critical, because otherwise there's something about psychoanalysis that cannot be mere information. Because it is information, it might actually function to be overconfidence that you have overcome the problems that Lacan is pointing out, which actually then makes you more vulnerable to them. So there's something about the style there that is very important. I think a wisdom of the mythic structure in general. The second thing is that I think also you were talking about how psychoanalysis, Freud starts with women's negative emotion. It's so critical, where he associates hysteria with truth. And because the woman, in having the body, the pregnancy, the menstruation, they cannot avoid the truth. The funny thing is, you say, oh, Freud is such a sexist because he's saying women is hysterical. No, hysterical is meaning women are more true. Men are more rational because they're more self-deceptive. Rationality is primarily a mechanism of self-deception and avoiding the truth. And so for Freud, psychoanalysis starts where the truth cannot be avoided. It starts where the real has broke through and you cannot escape it. So it starts with the woman's negative emotion. And basically, in a very real way, the world is becoming more of a first world nation, is becoming more feminine, ergo more hysterical. Thus we have pop fascism. Thus we have these movements.
And I'm against any political gesture which does not try to negate, sublate what has been achieved in feminism.
Exactly.
And I think that's a huge mistake. So, and that's another reason why psychoanalysis is important.
Well, because the irony is, without psychoanalysis, even if you intend not to efface the gains of, say, feminism, you end up doing so. Because when you don't face the negative emotion, you then launch a political program to, say, maybe avoid the negative emotion or to efface the negative emotion, which then must leave the feminine behind precisely. And then you've actually effaced, because, I like to say efface versus negate. You've effaced the gains of first wave feminism or second wave, or all these, I know there's first, second, and third, and different things. In the name of helping females, you've actually avoided the truth that has a fundamental feminine quality because we've not tarried with the negative, to use that phrase. And so I think what you're getting at is very important. But basically, this gets into, there's a temptation in first world nations to think you can gain there's a temptation to think you can maintain the progress of history without facing negativity. That's the underlying mistake of all of this. If you want to have the gains of technology not lead to various effacements, then you must face negativity. That's an Ivan Illich point. If you want to maintain the gains of the feminist movement, then you must face the negativity. If you want to maintain the gains of white-collar work over blue-collar work, because when you had primarily blue-collar work, people had lower life expectancies, children's labor, there's all these horrors that a world of blue-collar work would have. Well, if you want to maintain the gains of white-collar work, then you must face the negativity that comes with work that is more psychological, intellectual, and less physical, right? So here's the thing. Progress is only kept when you face negativity. This is the problem with the myth of progress. There's truth to progress. Of course there is. But the problem is the notion that progress takes care of itself. It's like, if there's progress, it eliminates negativity. Actually, the Hegelian would say, yes, there's progress through time, but it brings more negativity. You have to negate sublate.
I think specifically the line I always liked was that progress is equal to the deepening of contradiction.
Yes.
For example, so if you take, for example, I have a paper on the commons where I talk about the commons gap, where the commons gap is represented in different spheres like ecological, social, political, biological. Like ecological, you have all of the different things related to climate change. Social, you have all sorts of things related to immigration and movement of peoples on a global scale. Technological, you have just naming things like the birth control pill, but also things like artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. You think about biology, you have things like genetic engineering, genetic manipulations, all sorts of things like that, manufacturing different viruses, right? So in all of these domains, we're dealing with phenomena which people in 15th century didn't have to deal with.
Right.
But that first world, modern, globalized people, the planetary human society has to deal with, which simply involves the deepening of contradiction, or, as some literature will say, wicked problems. Wicked problems being problems which they don't have a linear problem solution situation. It's more just a new real, right? Like climate change is not a problem solution. It's not like we're going to go back to a certain stable view of the climate. Right. It's that there's a new real here, which actually my favorite joke about climate change is, if you think about climate change on the proper geological timescales, it's actually an extraordinarily positive thing, because the planet on the scale of millions of years goes through cycles of ice ages. And we're actually in a little blip of a non-ice age, which started 10,000 years ago. And the next ice age was supposed to happen in 5 to 10,000 years from now. But because of climate change, it's not going to happen. So this is the ultimate good news of climate change, is that if we can prevent, this is the crucial thing, if we can prevent Earth from becoming Venus, then it's an extra good thing, because it's delayed the next ice age. But this is an example where you can see the positivity of contradiction, that the deepening of contradiction is actually that's progress. But yeah, it's not this, it's basically not this model of progress, which is like an infantile, childlike model of progress, where you think there's going to be a treat at the end of the tunnel, where you're going to be in utopia, basically. Right. That's just, it sounds silly to say like that, but it's literally how people often think about things like, oh, there's a tunnel, and at the end of the tunnel of the nightmare of history, there's going to be a utopia at the end of it.
Well, that's
And
how.
yeah, and just that model, I think, needs to be psychoanalyzed, because it appears in many different symbolic constellations, irrespective of the ideology.
Well, because that sort of logic is the rational end of rationality. Rationality is fundamentally syllogistic, A to B, B to C, A equals C, and that's looking for a light at the end of the tunnel. It's looking for a treat. So if we don't complex, without psychoanalysis, rationality can't be quote unquote rational per se. It certainly can't be true, because rationality will just be coherence in dreaming that doesn't realize its own hunger for an internal coherence that then keeps it from the hysteria of truth, right? And that ultimately also is why I think the conspiracy is the masterpiece of rationality. I had that lovely talk with Hunter Coates on his book on Lacan and the subject and the conspiracy, Lacan and the conspiracy and different things. And I think that's so important because the conspiracy is the rational end of rationality that does not take seriously its non-rational dimension, which is the truth. It needs a truth to try to correspond with, but it doesn't like that because the truth makes you hysterical. Furthermore, that example you just gave of climate change might be the best metaphoric example of the problem of of how to think progress I've ever heard. So I'm going to have to use that. That's magical. I'll also note that Thomas Pynchon's novels on rationality, Conspiracy, and Crying Lot of 49, Gravity's Rainbow, those were always very influential for me, because Pynchon really does show you that humans as the rational animal is humans as the conspiratorial animal. And the conspiracy is basically an internally consistent system. It is an ideology. It's just a pure form of an ideology. It's a distilled, clear form of an ideology. Actually, arguably, conspiracy, I think, is the scapegoat of ideology. Because ideology can go, well, we're not a conspiracy. Look at those people over there. But it's actually the same form. So actually, ideology scapegoats conspiracy to act like it's not like that, when actually it's exactly like that. It's just more hidden. It's more subtle. It's more discreet. And that has led us to not understanding what rationality is. But the main point I wanted to make is that what you're saying is we cannot keep the progress of today without Lacan. You cannot maintain progress. Whatever progress we've had, we cannot keep without Lacan, without psychoanalysis. So everyone should sign up with the course if you want to maintain 2023 without it becoming the apocalypse. And so that's why what you're saying, progress is not a given. It requires being able to handle it, keeping it, not losing it. And that requires, in a first world nations, keeping the progress of a first world nation requires psychoanalysis. And that's why also basically this means that if you take the meta crisis seriously, or you think there's some truth to it, and surely there's some truth to one of the million crises that make it up, the only way to deal with the meta crisis is psychoanalysis. So anyone in the meta crisis conversation that doesn't take psychoanalysis seriously is not taking seriously what is needed for it.
I was just going to say, because there's this proliferation. I see now there's this spurious multiplicity of crises. That the crises just keep on, there's new words for each new crisis, and there's just a proliferation of crises, is that I think psychoanalysis in some sense resolves this in a way by saying the crisis is that you were born.
Yes.
Your birth was a crisis. Lacan labors over and over again to talk about, and I love the way he does this, is he situates the mind, he situates our psyches in the brute reality, obvious fact of the fact that when we're born in impotent bodies.
Yes.
Our bodies. So when you're talking about rationality as desiring coherence, when you're talking about rationality that desires coherence, what Lacan will say is the reason why the rationality and the ego wants a coherence, would be the specular image. It's because the body is incoherent. He'll specifically say it's because the body is uncoordinated.
Right.
Because the body is uncoordinated, the first thing the baby fantasizes about is a coherent other.
Yes, that's right.
And it wants that coherent other. It desires that coherent other. And unconsciously, it sees the other of the caregiver as absolute.
Yes. Because
what's the only other thing that you could conclude?
That's right.
Is that it's absolute. So, this is interesting, is that putting I often think about Nietzsche as like an arche-politics, a first politics, meaning it's not any one political, you can't get one political program out of Nietzsche, but it's almost like an opening gesture. And Nietzsche takes you to like the core of the mind, almost like, here's the unconscious mind. Yeah. I'm Nietzsche. Right? And then psychoanalysis is in some sense the attempt to institutionalize the unconscious, with various successes and various failures. The undeniable success of psychoanalysis is the way in which its language, its intuitive language, gets popularized and co-opted by all major other disciplines, even if it throws away the bits that it doesn't want to think about. But that somehow a maturation of psychoanalysis would be to bring it to the political, and to think through some of its core concepts about Oedipal dynamics, about negation in the father, about specular image in the mother, about the impotence of the body. These to me are core pieces of a politics. Is not that we're the rational animal. We are the rational animal in a sense, but we are the impotent animal. We are the impotent animal with, and where do our dreams of omnipotence go? They go to politics. They function in politics. We have this weird situation where we have impotent fools parading as omnipotent kings, right? And I think Lacan will call this ostrich politics. Politics where we have our head in the sand. And I think that's a pretty, it's a vivid metaphor. But yeah, I mean, I'll just I'll leave it there, I guess, for now.
Magnificent. Well, there's a few things. So first off, we tend to forget when we hear the rational animal, the animal part. Lacan is basically like, don't forget the animal part. And actually, that's a problem, because if we're rational animals, that means we're clever. We can figure out as animals how to be animals, or to be, to feed our drives and desires, and do it in a manner that's tricky, right? Like, we forget often when we hear the phrase rational animal, we forget the animal. We just hear rational. So it's like, oh, we're civilized. No. You're a rational animal. Don't forget the animal part. And basically what ends up happening is, in a first world nation where rationality is giving you relative comfort, economics, technology, you've kind of reached the end of what rationality can do for you. Now you have to address the animal part, and we have no training to do that. And we don't even want to deny. We're like, no. I don't want to talk about the animal part, because then I'd have to actually revisit what rationality is and what I am as a person. And so there's a de-emphasis of the animal part in the rational animal, which in a first world nation, it basically means you have to face that or you're screwed. Like, okay, you've done a great job with the rational stuff. Now let's face the animal part of that equation. No, I don't want to do that. Well, then we're in trouble. I really like also what you're saying about the meta crisis, because it's kind of a spurious infinity now, right? It's like a spurious crisis. And basically the only way to deal with a spurious infinity is with a true infinity, which is a circle relating on itself. So the crisis is that we're human. The crisis is that we're human beings and we don't know how to be human. And so we're blaming, it's the environmental crisis, it's the political crisis, it's the singularity crisis. Yeah. Those are all crises because we're humans and don't know how to handle them. If you as a human knew how to handle the environment, there wouldn't be an environmental crisis. If you knew how to handle the singularity, there wouldn't be an AI crisis, right? Like, all of these are quote unquote crises because of the response to the environment, the reaction to the technology, the reaction to pluralism, and so on and so forth. So fundamentally, it's a human crisis. And that's why, for me, I'm really interested in the topic of, say, pronatalism and antinatalism, because if you think about it, antinatalism is like the perfect solution to the meta crisis, right? We'll just get rid of the human being. Now, it's not an address, as I like to say, but it's certainly a solution. So the question is, why be born? If we don't have an answer for why to be born, well, then we're not going to solve anything, because we don't know how to be human or why to have human beings. But that means you also have to handle the human being. And that means you have to get into psychoanalysis to figure out how the human operates. And then if you do that, then the question to what you're saying goes to the question of scale. All right, we have a few given individuals, or maybe say 2 million people on planet Earth, that are able to understand how to be human, to address the human condition, and so on and so forth. How do you scale that? Because if you can't scale that, then you can't scale pronatalism. You're going to be stuck in a antinatalist zeitgeist, even if people are not directly antinatalist. In avoiding intimate relations or avoiding children, you're practically antinatalist, even if you're not like following the philosophy as a moral statement or whatever. So you basically have a world right now that is practically becoming antinatalist, even if it's not directly antinatalist. That will not stop unless we figure out how to be human, how to deal with the problem of being human, and that requires psychoanalysis. You can deal with climate change all you want or try to, but if you don't address the human being, it will just be 50 years before something else comes up.
I was gonna say I had a little bit of a rant with Audrey yesterday where it's happened many times where I hear certain activists about the ecology, and they're talking about the planet and the crisis of the planet, and they start crying or they start like choking up and coming to tears, and I'm just like, it can't be about the planet,
right?
It can't be about ecology. Like they're clearly upset about something else. Like, well, that's my intuition, and I will go too far on it, but yeah, I mean, it does come down to psychoanalysis to me, and the question of reproduction, and family, and how we reproduce. And it's a very, to me, there's a very simple story that I actually picked up from Osho, where there was a frog watching a centipede, and the frog was amazed by the centipede, and the frog said to the centipede, "Look, I'm watching you every day walk by this rock, whatever, and I just can't figure out how you walk. You've got 100 legs. How are you walking?" And then the centipede says, "Well, I never much thought about it, but now that you mentioned it, I'm having some trouble walking." So it's a little bit like that with human beings and reproduction, where we never really had to think about it. In fact, most people were, I mean, the story of humanity is in some sense babies having babies.
Yeah.
Very few people were ever in a situation, and women in particular were never in a situation where reproduction was their choice or something they could reflect on philosophically. Like, do I want to have children? What do I do with my reproductive potential? How do I want to live as an adult, and so forth? And now all of a sudden it's a normalized social condition where we have a cultural left, and a political left in particular, which censors any difficult conversations about these issues. And we have a political right and a cultural right which basically just wants to go back to old models of how it was done in the past. So to me, both of these options don't work. To me, this is basically why I would go to Nietzsche as a first politics and arche politics, to open up the space of what would a different politics be about. And to me, the primary, and this is the psychoanalytic question, which you said, why be born? Why be born? That to me is the zero level where we should be thinking the politics, because if we can't articulate a why be born, and the antinatalists, they always, and this is another interesting connection, they always rely on Buddhism, namely life is suffering. Life is suffering, so why do it? We all know life is suffering. So why continue? Why perpetuate it? Now, I think the psychoanalysis and its relationship to Buddhism, but psychoanalysis and its relationship to spirituality and religion in general is interesting. But specifically psychoanalysis in relationship to Buddhism on the question of suffering and happiness, to me, it sort of breaks those coordinates with the idea of the drive and the idea of what is essentially an immortal chain. And that immortal chain is linked. And to me, Buddhism tries to imagine, and I went to Buddhist retreats, temples, a few years ago. Buddhism tries to imagine a real of substance which is before language, which is pre-linguistic, as opposed to thinking about the real which is immanent to language.
Yes.
And that is the difference between psychoanalysis and Buddhism to me. And so if we have a politics which can think about the real which is immanent to language, which takes in all of the problems that we've encountered symbolically in the modern world, inclusive and first and foremost of phenomena like feminism, bringing in, and this is Alenka Zupančić will emphasize, feminism is not a splitting of the world into two. Feminism is a recognition that what was split into two is actually one world. That it's bringing women into that same world. Not splitting it in, not saying men have their place, women have their place, and this is a harmonious balance between the two. There's a discord at the heart of humanity, which men and women share. And and that brings us to that question: why be born? And that's a question for all of us. That's a question for obviously men and women, and for however you identify. But ultimately, however you identify, it comes down to your relationship to the generational chain on the level of symbolic identity.
Magnificent. The Buddhist says life is suffering. The psychoanalysts say, well, the Buddhist is like, why be born? Because life is suffering. And the response should be because suffering is life. But in order for suffering to be life, you need the psychoanalytical training. Like suffering allows a certain quality of being in life that allows beauty, truth, and goodness to be experienced in manners that without suffering you could not. Like the best of it, if you want to, like, if Leibniz is like God must make the best of all possible worlds, God would make a world with suffering, because suffering allows a quality of being that, if you believe in Christianity or something, can be carried into eternity, that changes the quality of eternity to be better because of the suffering, because suffering chisels. Now, the issue is the following. There's a difference between like suffering and trauma. And the problem is a lot of people they're like, I don't want to have kids because I was traumatized in my family and I don't want to perpetuate the trauma. That's completely understandable. The challenge of a first world nation is basically the possibility of trauma as distinct from suffering. Now, I'm not saying there hasn't been trauma in third world nation. That's not what I'm saying. But trauma as this sort of psychological, like subject eating itself, what's the meaning of life, all these different kind of problems, this deep wound comes out in the first world nation, and people are like, I don't want to perpetuate that, so I don't want to have kids that have that sort of trauma. The issue is the same world that makes possible the suffering, that makes life have a greater quality, is also the same world that makes trauma possible, right? So how do we keep trauma from happening and there just be the suffering, of which is the negation, sublation of life into a higher quality of life that would not be possible without that suffering? That requires skills. That requires what Lacan is talking about. That requires the psychoanalytical field. Like basically people, because, I like to talk about the absolute choice. Basically having children now is the ultimate absolute choice. That is the ultimate movement of self-consciousness to reason and the phenomenology. Like it is the ultimate absolute choice. Why would you make the choice? If you say, I don't know how to avoid creating trauma, I don't know how to avoid being traumatizing, therefore I'm not going to have kids because that's responsible, because I'll just spread the trauma. That's completely reasonable, unless you learn how not to traumatize, how not to exist in traumatic environments. And of course, we're all going to make mistakes, but a lot of psychoanalysis is how to respond to the inevitable mistakes. When you face trauma, you're inevitably going to suffer different traumas, but how do you integrate with the traumas, right? As opposed to right now, most people's traumas are free-floating. They don't know what to do with it. They suffer lack and they don't know what to do with lack, right? Well, guess what? Take Philosophy Portal's class on Lacan and you can start to learn what to do with those different things. Like it's so practical. It's all tied together. Like for me, psychoanalysis, and because to me it's tied with literature, as I was saying at the beginning, it's all tied to making people feel like they can make the absolute choice. Like you said, this is so critical. Continuing the generation has never been an act of generation, like a creative act, because it's never been chosen. Now the issue is that the generations is tied to a choice of generating. That's never happened before. And now we have to do that. Well, that means we have to basically make an absolute choice, which we have every reason not to make because we're traumatized and there's so much pain and agony in the world. And look, global warming is going to kill us all. Well, that would require, if dealing with, say, the climate crisis, the meta crisis, is dealing with the problem of being human, then the same problem that's keeping people from having children is the same problem that's leading to the meta crisis, which is we don't know how to be human. We don't know how to manage being human. We don't know how to integrate with lack. And basically what I hear Millar talking about with Rollins, Todd McGowan, all these different people are basically like, what would it mean to have a humanity that integrates with lack, to go to our series with Ebert and Tim and different, it's like, that is what people need to learn how to do, or even know that it's a problem. Like even just hearing about Lacan and knowing that lack is essential, just having that knowledge, even if you don't get like real practical skills on what to do, just knowing that is the human condition changes everything. And greatly, like, then you're like, oh, I'm dealing with trauma not because I'm something wrong with me, but because I'm human. And the human is a being of whom engages and suffers various traumas. But the question is, can we integrate with that trauma, or does it become something that happens and we don't know why it happened or what to do with it? It's all tied together. And so dealing with Lacan also, like it's directly tied to pronatalism. It's directly tied to the meta crisis. And I think also you were talking about politics, where right now, like people are, you have this sense of a one, like if everyone was one, then there wouldn't be politics because we'd all be one, right? Politics requires a split, as you were saying with Supansha, but also a sense of the one, of which makes people engage in the politics. But since the one never was, this creates a kind of pathological condition. Well, what if instead of the one being a oneness, it was instead something more like a harmony? With a symphony orchestra, right? Like we've talked before about the difference between kind of oneness and harmony and different things. Harmony requires difference. And today, where the sexes like male and female are together, when they were separated, it wasn't possible to have a harmony because they were separated. It was isolationist, right? It was the unity of isolation. Now, because males and females with feminism has brought them together, that makes possible a harmony, a negation sublation, but only if we are able to handle the difficulty of otherness. Therefore, you need the psychoanalytical training. Therefore, you need the realization of, oh, this negativity isn't a sign that I've done something wrong. It's a sign that I'm on the road to possible harmony if I can learn to integrate with it. So the entire board flipped, but without, I'll give it back to you. Basically, without psychoanalysis, you don't have the right horizon by which to think about everything going on. Like psychoanalysis is an entire horizon to think about everything going on. It's not just an option. It's not just another option of all the things you can learn. It is the very horizon by which everything needs to be situated, especially in first world nations, that if not so situated, will make us incapable of dealing things with the meta crisis, with the antinatalism, with the political, because we don't have the right framework by which to think all these things. And then I think, you know, all the different seminars are basically about people talking about a reconfiguration of a various topic, whether it be religion, politics, in terms of a psychoanalytical horizon, as opposed to a non-psychoanalytical horizon, which basically in first world nations especially is not an option. If you continue to make that mistake, you cannot keep the gains of progress. Progress will be lost.
Yeah, I totally agree. What's at stake is the loss of progress, as opposed to seeing the lack inherent in progress.
Yes.
To reference McGowan's distinction between loss and lack. So let me just give a little bit of an overview for those with us, for those listening, in the context of our discussion. What is the value of the Lacan course this fall? So let me say that the first thing is the meta frame of the course. I think I can make this a good argument. I think the meta frame of the course does embody the generational difference. Namely, that we have guest teachers who are of the older generation. We have some younger collaborators and helpers who are of the younger generation. And that matters. It matters, okay? Like, and this is not me saying this as a, I'm 37, so I have a superiority over someone who's 30, or I have a superiority over someone who's 25. No. I defer to someone like Boothby. I defer to someone like McGowan out of respect, out of a willingness to, in some sense, submit to the generational chain and to participate in the generational chain. And I encourage everyone to situate their minds in some way, their own way they choose that generational chain. Like, I could go on about different examples about that, but I think that an incredible skill for a young man or a young woman to pick up is the capacity to try to work collaboratively with older people who you respect in a respectful way. And we all go through troubles with learning that. And I've had huge troubles with learning that in my house, and that's in some sense, but it's going through those troubles which allow you to learn how to do that well. So first, about specifically Lacan's teaching. Lacan's teaching, I think, in the Écrits is oriented towards breaking us away from an imaginary fusion of a one to a symbolic real of otherness, which brings us into a disorientation of lack and excess. And so if that seems like something you'd like to investigate in great detail, I think the Écrits is offering that possibility. Again, it's a breaking from an imaginary fusion to a symbolic real of otherness, which has a disorienting lack and excess, which we can only learn how to navigate intersubjectively in communities or in collaborative networks, which are, in some sense, trying to share a certain language, share a certain ritual. I think what Peter Rollins is going to bring to the course, now going into some of the guest lectures, I think what Peter Rollins is going to bring to the course is contradiction as the fundamental heart of the reality. And can we build a church around that heart of reality? Can we build a church around that heart of a core contradiction in the other? I think that's going to be incredibly important, not only for his participation in the course, but also for his larger projects, which he's building out in his own career. Next, Isabel Millar with Patty Politics I think she's bringing in the politics to think about suffering the way you were thinking about suffering. Life as suffering, suffering as life. To bring in that, to consider suffering in a Lacanian sense as jouissance. How do we enjoy our sufferings? How do we enjoy our tensions? Right? And this is a mega question for a hyper-psychological society. How do we get a perspectival shift on our own sufferings? And also to become political animals again. How do we once again take political stakes in our society? Which is increasingly, we're depoliticized. Boothby is going to be bringing in the concept of das Ding as this irreducible unknown in the other, as at the same time the most precious opening to love. Right? So that's very crucial again about the other. And then finally, I think McGowan is going to bring in not only lack as primary to loss, but lack as a motor for value, and specifically in our current historical situation, lack as a motor for capitalist value. And how do we think beyond capitalist value? Right? In the context of lack, in the context of our social, I make a play with Owen sometimes, techno-capitalism to techno-socialism. You know, these are ideas that we could think about. But that's not all. I did make a sale, but that's not all. No. Okay, so but also in the course, we're going to have exegetical reading spaces, and the idea of the exegetical reading spaces is you get spaces, one where I'm not there. They're going to be led by Dimitri Croimans, who's again one of the younger generation. So I think this is a great chance for people in the younger generation to have a space where they can assert and develop their own discourse, right? And specifically have those spaces to highlight the gems of the Écrits, because there are certain gems we won't have time to go in full detail in the course, which we'll do in the exegetical reading spaces. Then finally, 2 new additions to the course, which are going to be announced officially this month. The first edition is we're going to have real talk spaces, which are going to be led by Owen Cox, Daniel Frege, and Raven Connolly. And those real talk spaces are going to be after our guest lectures. So we're going to have guest lectures, and then right after we'll go to another room and have real talk about those guest lectures. Right? So you're not only going to get a good lecture and a good chance to interact with the guest lecturers, but then we'll collectively have real talk about it. And then finally, we're also going to be bringing back the philosophy of Lac with Daniel Garner, with Tim Adlin of Voicecraft, and with Alex Ebert. Philosophy of Lac was a series we did on my channel a year and a half ago, maybe even 2 years now. And the idea of the philosophy of Lac was to think philosophical concepts, foundational philosophical concepts, through the lens of Lac. And I think that in the Lacan course, where Lac is fundamental, I think that this is a perfect chance to bring back that conversation, and to do it in the context of the class, I think will be more intimate and potentially very powerful, and a great way to end the course as a whole, because it will open us up to 2024 with, I think, a philosophical perspective on psychoanalysis, which is allowing us to move in the social in a different way. So that's the course. I think there's a lot there. I think it's going to be mega. I think it's going to be a mega challenge, but mega valuable. Well, that's my pitch for the course.
I think it's a magnificent pitch, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And I think, also I would like to tell everyone that if you go to the ogrose.com website, you will see an opportunity to apply for a scholarship to be part of the Lacan class. And you will also have opportunities at Voicecraft, Bad Guru with Alex Ebert. And we're just thrilled about this opportunity. There are 3 questions that you can fill out. They will be reviewed, and we will be awarding a scholarship later in the month for someone who would like to take it. And I absolutely think that people need to take this class because there are real stakes in this. Basically, without the psychoanalytical way of thinking, the Buddhists seem to be right, that life is suffering, right? So why be alive? But once you get Lacan and you realize, oh, wait a minute, there are ways to integrate with Lac. There are ways to take this seriously. Well, then suffering is life. And I think that is the challenge for first world nations, to do this very thing. And if we don't do this very thing, then politics will dissolve, religion will dissolve, technology will perhaps dissolve us, we'll dissolve one another in our political struggles. Like, the stakes are very real. And so the question is, how do we deal with the stakes? And I think that requires dealing with these texts, going to these texts. I've been very interested. Every single class of Philosophy Portal ends with a conference, and there's also an anthology. I've really enjoyed all of the entries, both in Enter the Alien, the Abyssal Arrows have just been magnificent. I highly suggest everyone pick them up. The entries, the essays in it are just wonderful. All reviews are a massive help as well. For anyone who's purchased the book, please do. And I've already been thinking somewhat on Lacan paper, and I've been really kind of, the question at the top of the paper is, why is Lac a good thing? Like, why is Lac a good thing? And I think sometimes when you hear all of this about Lacan and Lac, it can sound very kind of dismal and kind of nihilistic. But let's take what Todd McGowan said. Lac helps us deal with loss. If you always feel like you've lost something and, oh, I need to go get it. Once you get that, no. Lac, the feeling of loss, is actually an indication of the ontology of lack, and you don't need to get anything. In fact, there's nothing wrong with you. That feeling of lack is actually just part of what it means to be human. And then maybe in a Thomas Wynne sense, you let it be and you annihilate the loss into lack. Well, suddenly your life is not controlled by loss because of the ontology of lack. Also, I think lack makes possible intrinsic motivation. I don't think it'd be possible for the human to be intrinsically motivated if they weren't a Mobius strip, because they couldn't loop in on themselves. Precisely the lack then allows the possibility to be your own motivation in the name of that lack, to value things for yourself. Because the world doesn't give values, you create values in the Nietzsche sense, and therefore you can be your own intrinsic motivation. And also, lack opens up the other, just like Boothby was saying, right? So there are many ways that lack is a good thing, but you have to think that. But you have to have those ideas. And if you don't have, say, a class like what's offered at Philosophy Portal, if you don't have thinkers like Lacan or Hegel or Zizek, et cetera, so forth, then it may never occur to you that lack is a good thing. One, you'll probably always think that lack is loss and then spend your life trying to fill the loss and never getting anywhere. And you certainly may not ever occur to you that lack is a good thing. And if it is a good thing, well, suddenly it would be good to change politics in light of Lacan, to change religion in light of Lacan, to change relationships in light of Lacan, to have children. Suddenly, all of these things become good because lack is good, because lack opens possible horizons. Now, it's a challenging good. It's a risky good. It's a good that could cause us a lot of pain. But any good that doesn't means it's a good that makes us the last men. A good that doesn't entail risk means all it can do is make us the last men, like Nietzsche talks about, right? If we want to be the children of Nietzsche, we need to, the source of goodness has to bring with it a lack, a difficulty, a challenge, a risk. And that's what Lacan offers us, but we have to see it that way. We have to look at it that way, and we have to be taught how to experience that way. And basically, if we don't, the stakes are high, as I hope this conversation has made very clear. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it to you for closing remarks, because I'm very afraid to say that I hear the wind and I'm afraid the storm's going to come up. So I've really enjoyed. It's coming. I've really enjoyed this. The question of scale to me is so massive.
Yeah.
I'm always taken by Dietrich McCloskey, who basically argues that ideas make the world. In her book, The Bourgeoisie Virtues, he's like, the idea that work has dignity changed work and made people willing to work and thus innovate and thus create technologies. The idea of freedom changed the world. And basically the arguments he wants to make is that scale starts with ideas. Now, not merely ideas. The ideas have to be translated into practical action. If you have the idea that work has dignity, but you don't have the freedom to work, or, you know, there's no legal structure, then it's not going to matter. But ideas are at the core. And Dietrich McCloskey makes this argument. So for me, another reason why classes like this are so important is because if indeed ideas are at the start of the scaling problem, well, then the idea that lack is good, and the idea that lack is lack and it's essential, and the idea that humans are a Mobius strip, and that the idea that humans need to work toward harmony versus unity, to use that distinction, that's the beginning of dealing with the problem of scale. And so if we don't get the ideas right, then all we can scale is things that have the wrong ideas. And so the work that you're doing at Philosophy Portal is the beginning of the scale issue. And then the question is, what does that look like in religion? Well, Peter Rollins is doing different events that look like in religion. What does that look like in politics? Well, Isabel Millar is dealing with that. Todd McGowan, Boothby, all these different people are then going into their own specialties, if you will, to look at what it means in those different institutions. And it would seem like the problem of scale today must be dealt with in a very decentralized manner, which arguably the internet makes possible. And so to deal with that problem, I think getting the right ideas about psychoanalysis, because if you want to scale a different world, you have to change the horizon by which the world is understood. And that's always ideas. The world can never give you a different horizon in of itself. The subject must arrive at those different ideas and then carry themselves in the world differently, but it has to be concrete. It has to be concrete. But that's why, for me, Lacan is so important, because the ideas of Lacan are in the concrete of the intimate relation. It is in the concrete of the other. It is not some theoretic that helps you avoid the other, like a conspiracy or some theory of everything. No, what Lacan is putting forth is the philosophy, the literature, the way of life that is situated intimately in intimate relation. And if we cannot face that, if we cannot absolutely choose that, then it will not be capable for us to create and give rise to generations through a choice of generating. And I think it's very wise for the class to integrate different generations, because I don't think we're going to be capable of generating through pronatalism or children unless we integrate with the generations. And I know Bruce Alderman has a talk at Voicecraft I was part of, and he'll be putting out on eldership, and I think it's a big deal. Like, the separations of the generations has hurt generating. And so bringing those together is so important. And then when you see all the different generations, all the different genders, all the different philosophical backgrounds coming together and working with the real of one another and the essentialness of lack, and you then have an example of how it is possible from that to get a harmony, then it becomes unimaginable that harmony can be scaled. The question is simply the work. So I think Philosophy Portal is doing that work. So thank you for doing it, Cadell.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to stress, I think, this final point you're making about the combination of the different generations and the generating of the generations as a crucial thing. And so, yeah, I mean, like I said in sort of pitching the course, I think that's the important meta background is that there is a chance here in this course to not only get a certain education, a certain point of view, a certain perspective, but also an embodied representation of what it looks like to embed your mind within a generational structure, and the positive good that can come from that. And it's very interesting to think about this huge problem of scale, the way in which we're moving away from the possibility of traditional forms of centralizations, and at the same time in decentralization, how we still reproduce, I think, Oedipal constellations, even in a decentralized sense. And so that is, to me, the other crucial thing that I'd want to end on. The crucial thing I want to end on is to embed the intelligence within the intimacy of life, to embed the intelligence within the intimacy with the other on the level of sexual difference. I don't want to propose any normativity there, because I don't think it implies any normativity, other than the presupposition that human beings want intimate contact with the other. And then you can fill in the categories and derive the categories however you want in regards to how those categories work for you. And also humans have, I think also most humans have a desire to somehow integrate generationally with people older than them, with people of the other sex than them, and people younger than them. And that's what makes a human society possible. So I think psychoanalysis gives us the tools to think that on a higher order. As you've been saying, we live in a society which is incredibly psychologized, the being overwhelmed by the excessiveness of other subjectivities. And so if we don't have a knowledge which is embedded in the subject and taking the real of the subject seriously, we lose. And ultimately, we throw around names. Of course, there are names that become more pronounced than others. When we talk about Lacan, when we talk about Hegel, of course, I've taught on specific thinkers: Hegel, Nietzsche, Lacan, Freud. Why these thinkers? It's because they're really, really taking the subject seriously. That's at the end of the day. At the end of the day, they're really taking the subject seriously. They're not that they're accepting, they're negating, sublating the objective scientific universe. They're all negating, sublating it. They're not just deconstructing it. Scientific universe, scientific objectivity is important, and so forth. There's a way in which scientific objectivity creates the conditions of possibility for a new confrontation with the subject we haven't had to think about before. Psychoanalysis and continental philosophy in many ways give us the tools that I think to help us, and that's actually the meaning behind systems and subjects, that to think the subject internal to the scientific universe, And as I think we've been making clear throughout this conversation, the stakes are very high here. So lots of chances to learn, lots of chances to connect. And with that, I just thank you, OG, for this conversation. It's fantastic. And the work you're doing is fantastic. So thank you for what you're doing as well.
Well, thank you, Cadell. I have enjoyed it very much. I think you put that very well. I think, we've gone through, humanity went through a non-rational age that was more mythical, more religious. Then we've gone through a kind of rational age with kind of science and the Enlightenment. And now we need a kind of non-rational with the non in parentheses, as I like to put it. And that requires thinking the subject and taking these thinkers seriously. And I think also if people want relationships, if they want to be with others, well, then they have to learn to live with the reality that they aren't what they think they are, to reference Iago again. And if you want to relate to someone, then you have to know who you are relating and what you are relating. And there's always the problem, too, that the moment you think about the subconscious, you're making it conscious. So it's slipping away. And so you have to do the work for a lifetime. So what does it mean to do the work for a lifetime? What does it mean to be a problem that you manage as opposed to solve? That means you live a certain way. And the class and Lacan and psychoanalysis and all the different thinkers that you work on, they're not merely ideas. There are addresses. They're not merely explanations. They help you address yourself and to address the other. And if we want to live in a world where we live with others, then we must learn to address, to locate ourselves. What is our address? And then address the other and to help locate them, and so that we can locate one another together. And that is the challenge. And if we do not rise to the occasion of that challenge, we will not maintain the gains of progress. And in fact, you progress until you don't, and then you don't. And so the stakes are high.
I just say that Lacan opens the book by saying the style is the man himself. If we say the style with the addition, the style is the man that one addresses.
Absolutely.
So it's always this question of the address, always this question of the one and the other, and style and addressing is central. And I think we should think about that throughout the course in this context of the generational, and that I think will make for a very interesting fall.
I think it will be a wonderful fall. Addressing and generating are tied together. People that are not addressed will not generate. They will struggle to generate. And I think the fall will be magnificent. The class starts on September 3rd. The last day to sign up is September 3rd, and the first presentation will be on that day as well. I would also suggest for everyone to see the seminars that occurred that can be found on Cadell's channel. Peter Rollins, Millar, Boothby, McGowan. They were magnificent, and I really, really enjoyed them and gained a lot from them. I think also I'm very excited to hear about the real talks that will be occurring. I think the conversations after those presentations will be magnificent. And also, I know David was mentioning how someone had said just the opportunity to work on your writing, to the end of the course is present a chance to write, to be part of an anthology and a conference, that is invaluable, and it really is. And so that's another opportunity. So it's very, very generous. What you do is very generous, Cadell. And thank you for all that you do. It's been a pleasure.